Welcome to my 250th video on my work with OO gauge. This video will feature a Hornby Dublo Castle class model that I picked up on eBay UK, which ended up donating its tender chassis to get my converted mainline Jubilee running again on my 3-rail tabletop. I've done a lot of work with the Hornby Dublo model of the Stania 8F locomotive, sold as seen here in BR black livery as LT25 LMR 8F freight locomotive. I bought 5 or 6 of these at least. The model is inherently a natural fit for me, as I principally model pre-war LMS operations, and this is, in fact, one of only 2 actual pre-war LMS locomotives produced in Dublo 3-rail, the other being the Duchess of Atholl. Some other Dublo models were close, such as the 264 tank, but that was modelled on the BR Standard Class 4MT, derived from LMS designs, but not actually an LMS engine. So I would naturally have wanted to put a couple of 8Fs into service on my railway, remarked naturally as in LMS service. But the reason I've acquired half a dozen or more of these rather than just a couple is that the pickup system used on the Dublo 8F model, with the centre rail pickup coming from plungers on the tender, makes it very convenient to use 8F tenders for converting various 2-rail models for 3-rail running, without the need for struggling to find a way to mount a centre rail pickup on the loco. So I've done quite a number of 2-rail to 3-rail conversions using 8F tenders. Now, the Dublo 8F came out in mid-1958, but the system of using plungers on the tender for centre rail pickup was actually introduced with the Dublo Bristol Castle model, which came out the previous year in late 1957. So when I saw this Dublo Bristol Castle going fairly cheap on eBay UK, my thought was that it would be interesting to check it out, and that I might be able to use its tender in some way to assist with one of my 3-rail conversions. I bought this model for £40 plus shipping. Like the 8F, the Bristol Castle was only released for Dublo in BR livery. Of course, it was originally a Great Western locomotive. I tried the Castle model on my 3-rail test track, and it did run quite well in both directions. I got the model onto the bench. Apart from anything else, I wanted to be sure to clean the wheels before putting it onto my main 3-rail tracks, as they're hard enough to keep clean at the best of times, so the last thing I need to do is run a model with filthy wheels on them. You can see here that the Castle model is set up pretty much the same as the 8F, with the loco simply picking up power from the side rails on both sides and the centre rail pickup coming from the 2 plungers on the tender. The power picked up by the tender plungers is passed to the loco by a single wire. The tender chassis and body are both die-cast. A simple drawbar is screwed at both ends to loco and tender. The way this wire goes through a gap in the front of the tender indicates that this particular model has been modified at some point. This is not how things would have originally been supposed to work. There should be a fibre plate in that gap with a metal socket in it, and then the wire from the loco would plug into that socket, making it easier to separate loco and tender if required. For some reason, someone has removed the fibre plate with the contact socket from the front of this tender and soldered the wire from the loco directly into the interior of the tender. I started by using a Pico-powered bronze brush to clean the driving wheels of the loco. Then I thoroughly cleaned all of the wheels with a bronze brush in a rotary tool. With the wheels cleaned, I got the Bristol Castle model onto my 3-rail tracks for some trial running. Okay, let me see if I can just show this Dublo Castle class, Bristol Castle, running. Famous last word. 85% there on Gauge Master Controller. Which is so, it's kind of a lot of power because he hasn't been remagnetized or anything. But he does basically run. Now, I'm really very much in 2 minds as to what we're to do about this engine, really. I don't run British Railways, and I don't really run Great Western, albeit that I believe one Great Western Castle did run in an experimental fashion on the Western Main Line at one point, but not in any permanent way, just as an experiment. I bought this more, to be honest, with the idea of using parts from it in my free rail conversions for LMS engines. I thought maybe I've got a Jubilee I converted before, but then I stole the tender off it, and I thought this might provide parts to complete that Jubilee again, but I don't know, we'll see anyway. But it does in fact run, so you can't complain, because I only paid £40 for it, although mind you, of course, then I had to pay eBay global shipping, so it was twice that or more to get to me. I did feel a little guilty about the idea of stealing parts from the Bristol Castle, but for my running, a loco such as the Jubilee would be much more to be desired. This is a mainline split chassis Jubilee which I modified some time ago for three-rail running. It's seen here along with its original plastic mainline tender. I paired it with a repainted Dublo 8F tender when I originally converted it, but then I subsequently stole that tender for use with a converted Triang Princess Royal class. So the Jubilee had been sitting on a shelf without a tender for a while. Now I figured that I should be able to use parts from the Bristol Castle to get this Jubilee into service again. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it. Simply repainting the tender from the Castle model wouldn't be appropriate, as the body of the Castle tender was of a Great Western design, not at all correct for running with a Jubilee. Jubilees mostly ran with large Stanier tenders, as seen here, basically the same as those used for the 8F. Although Jubilees were also sometimes run with different tenders, such as straight-sided Fowler models. This is the original mainline model tender. I thought that perhaps I would be able to mount the plastic body of this tender onto the chassis of the Bristol Castle tender. I did do something similar to that with an 8F tender chassis when converting a Midland 4P compound for three-rail running. This is the bottom of the mainline tender. I undid the only visible screw, well, other than the one holding on the coupling. That allowed me to separate the tender chassis and body. And here are the mainline tender chassis and body separated. The body of the mainline tender was cast with the steps and the rear buffer beam integrated into it, which was potentially problematic. One set of steps was broken off, which I hadn't noticed before. Here's the bottom of the Bristol Castle tender. It looked as though it should probably disassemble in the same way as the 8F tender. I undid the screw on the bottom of the tender chassis. This did indeed allow me to lift the tender body from the chassis, although I couldn't entirely separate the two due to the wire from the loco passing through the front of the tender body. You can see here how the wire from the loco has been soldered directly into the tender, connecting to the plunger pickups. I undid the screw attaching the drawbar to the tender. This allowed me to detach the tender chassis from the loco, although everything was still held together by that wire. I took the electrical tape off the join in the wire. I actually tried to unsolder the end of the wire from where it was connected, but it didn't want to come off, as the soldered connection was rather involved. It is at the base I'm talking here, so I ended up just snipping off the wire at the end. I now had the chassis of the Bristol Castle tender completely separated. It appeared almost exactly similar to the chassis used for the Dublo 8F tender. I had a tender body from an 8F sitting around on the bench, as this was left over from my Midland compound conversion. Here you can see the Castle tender chassis with the Castle tender body and the 8F tender body. The similarities are obvious. Note how the 8F tender body has its fibre board for mounting the contact in place in the slot at left, whereas the Castle tender body has that slot for the fibre board, but the board itself is missing. I tried the 8F tender body on the Castle tender chassis. It appeared to fit perfectly. I rather suspect that Meccano simply reused the Bristol Castle tender chassis when creating the 8F model. I did try the plastic body from the main line tender against the Castle tender chassis. It could probably have been made to fit, but that would have required some fairly major surgery on the mainline tender body to remove the buffer beam and the steps. I could have gone either way, but it seemed that it would probably be more straightforward just to repaint and mark the 8F tender body and then mount that to the Castle tender chassis, on which it would fit directly using the same mounting screw. So I started by brush painting the 8F tender body. I used Model Master British Crimson paint, into which I had mixed a little black to better match it with Hornby Dublo LMS Crimson Lake. I also painted the Castle tender chassis, doing my best to paint around the wheel hangers and springs, which would normally be left black. Here is the 8F body on the Castle chassis after the paint dried. It still needs a little touching up, but it's not too bad. Here's the other side, rather more touching up required on this side. The coupling on the Castle tender chassis was bent, and it would not be usable like that. I adjusted that coupling with a pair of needle nose pliers and tested it with a Dublo wagon. Next, I needed to create a connection between the plunger pickups of the Castle tender chassis and the contact mounted in the front fibre board of the 8F tender body. I started by cutting a suitable length of wire. I stripped the ends of the wire and tinned them. Next, I soldered one end of the wire to the contact on the fibre board, using my helping hand to help. Then I soldered the other end of the wire to the connection point on the Castle chassis. This was where the wire from the loco had been connected before. There appears to be a resistor in sequence between the wire connection and the pickups, and a capacitor connected across to what looks rather like a coil, for RF suppression presumably. I bent the wire round to position the fibre board more or less correctly for mounting in the tender body. Then I slid the fibre board back into its slot in the 8F tender body. Now I mounted the tender body onto the chassis using the original mounting screw from the 8F. For some reason the mounting screws from the 8F and the Castle appeared rather different lengths and different threads. Now I had a repainted and reassembled tender ready for connection to the Jubilee loco. I had created a suitable connection piece on the end of the wire from the Jubilee loco when I originally converted it, and now I plugged this into the socket on the front of my newly assembled tender. I tested with my bench power supply, applying power to a plunger on the tender and to the wheels of the loco, testing the wheels on both sides, as I wanted to be sure that things were working electrically before proceeding further. The loco motor worked fine like this. Next, I needed to apply LMS markings to the tender. For this I used HMRS press-fix transfers in LMS yellow. I cut out LMS letters and applied them to the side of the tender. That worked reasonably well, although the L came out over the rivets. I did the same thing on the other side of the tender. I wanted to put an overcoat to protect the decals, but I didn't want to get it onto the wheels, so I masked with Tamiya masking tape. Here's the tender back after spraying with a coat of clear matte acrylic. I used Krylon low odor matte this time, as I found that the Mod Podge I had used before didn't produce as matte a result as I'd like. I plugged the wire from the Jubilee loco back into the tender, and then reconnected the drawbar using the original Castle screw. Here's the Jubilee assembled with its new tender on the bench. I got the newly connected Jubilee onto my 3-rail tracks for some running. So now I'll finish with some running video of this model. So here's the Jubilee, which was originally as a mainline Jubilee, with its stolen tender base from a Castle class on the tracks, and we'll give it some power. I'm a bit surprised how much power it needs, given that it's not really an old engine. It's not exactly modern, the mainline split chassis, but still. I mean, that's 90% on the gauge master. We reduced it to 85, but still, I'm kind of shocked that it's a relatively modern engine, and it's not like an old Dublo engine, it needs that much power. Of course, I mean, that's a heavy tender. Just pulling that heavy tender is probably kind of slightly hard work for the old mainline loco. Oh well, anyway. We'll see if it can pull a couple of coaches, although I know even when I was running it before it was struggling pulling coaches. In fact, I gave up trying to pull the old Dublo coaches with it and coupled some more modern coaches with it. So I'll see if I can find a couple of coaches to couple up with it. Okay, so now I've got the Jubilee coupled up with a couple of coaches. These are actually mainline coaches, not that they're for running on the mainline. They're made by the mainline company, the mainline brand, same as the locomotive, and they've got rather an odd assortment of couplings on them. We got a simplex coupling on the front there to couple up to the tender, then they're coupling up to each other with tension lock couplings, and then for some reason the brake, where is it, has a caddy coupling on the back. I didn't put that on, I guess it just came to me with that on. But since it's the back of the brake, I don't desperately need to couple anything to it, so I just haven't bothered to change it. I did put the simplex coupling on the front. I took the tension lock off. Okay, let's see if he can pull these. I know he struggles to pull anything a bit. He's not a very powerful engine. Oh, blimey, yes he does. Yeah, he struggles. He's not really getting all that much wheel slip. He's just kind of struggling. Yeah, he's not a very powerful engine. And then just pulling the... is he getting wheel slip there? It's hard for me to see. Maybe a little bit as he goes around the corners, but... yeah, I mean, just pulling that heavy tender imposes more strain on him than he was expecting, because of course his own original tender was just a lightweight plastic thing with virtually no weight to it. Whereas that one weighs more than the loco, I think. Being all die-cast. Oh, I thought we derailed there, it made a funny noise, but no, we still seem to be running. Okay, well I think we'll call that a day, won't we? Let's stop him where I can sort of see him, but yes. So, well, he's got his own tender, and he can have that tender now. I think I'm going to just... I'm not going to steal that one off him. Hopefully we'll leave that tender with the Jubilee. So we've got now a fully running 3-rail Jubilee.